Kita mau ngintil lagi nih kalian. Jangan lupa buat klik subscribe dan like juga guys. Ayo kita rame-rame bangun channel ini supaya memberikan manfaat dan juga hiburan kepada banyak orang. Setuju?
One of the important aspects of any program development project is to document your code. And one way you can document your code is by writing comments or remarks directly in your program itself. Writing comments in your code allows a person, either whether it be yourself or a future programmer, to review in plain English what your thought was and what your solution was to a particular problem. Or it may simply identify things that will make the debugging and program maintenance process a lot easier in the future. This is particularly true if you're working in a group or a team of programmers where you have multiple people and you have multiple ideas and thoughts that need to be put down for future use. Using our address label maker program, you see that I have added two additional buttons. One is a clear form button and an exit button. Now, I've already documented the create label button. By opening up the code window, you'll see that I already have a comment that says creates complete address label. And I want to note that you don't have to just create one comment for event procedure. If necessary, you could create a comment for every line. Now sometimes that's a bit much, but it is possible. You could have a line for every comment. Now it's important to note that the comments themselves are not executable, which simply means that the comment does not tell the computer to do or act upon anything. It is simply there for humans to read and to understand and to help in the interpretation of the code. Now returning to our form, let's create a comment for the clear form button. Now we'll discuss the code for the clear form button shortly, but the first thing I want to do is to comment that. So I simply double click and that opens up my code window for my so-called reset form button. And I simply want to begin with an apostrophe and write a comment such as, this button will clear the contents of the text boxes and allow for additional input by the user. Now I purposely made this a fairly long comment so as to show you that, number one, it will indeed scroll across the screen. And that's okay. That does not bother Visual Basic whatsoever. If, however, you want to be able to view the entire comment, you can simply break the line. For example, after the word and, I can simply press the enter key. And then notice that you will need another apostrophe before the first letter of the first word of the second line. So now you have the entire comment. Technically it's two comments, but it's really one sentence. This button will clear the contents of the text boxes and allow additional input by the user. So then you could then write your code below that. Again, we will revisit this soon. Returning to the form, I will also write a comment for the exit button. Just as you might expect, the purpose of this button is to exit or close the program. So I'll simply write that this button exits the program, or something along those lines. Again, the comment is entirely up to you in terms of syntax, spelling. Whatever words you spell there will appear exactly as you type them. They will not be corrected. No syntax errors are possible with comments, other than the fact that you may leave out the apostrophe. If you do leave out the apostrophe, such as this, you will get some syntax messages. But once you type the apostrophe and finish that line, no matter what you type from that point forward will be accepted. In this movie, we will focus on the process of writing code to clear the text boxes of a form. Using our address label maker program and using the clear form button, I will want to write code that will allow the user to click and then delete or clear the contents of each of the text boxes. Now, to be able to do this, I need to remind myself of the names of these text boxes. So if I bring up the Properties window and click on the first name text box, I will see the name of the text box is first name text box. Last name is the last name text box. The street is the street text box. City is the city text box. State text box. And the zip code is the zip code text box. We need to reference each of these boxes in the code, so we need to know their names. So if I open up the clear form button by simply double clicking, and now I can close the properties window to give us a little more space on the screen. Below the comment that I've written for the reset form button, I will then begin to write the code. Now, if you have a difficult time remembering the name of your controls on the form, another way is by clicking the drop down arrow on the left pane of the form design code window, and that will provide a list of all the objects, including the controls, that are on the form currently. For example, you see the name, first name text box, last name text box, state text box, and so forth. So this is one way you can get a quick list of the items. So if I begin typing first name text box, if I press the dot key, I should get this IntelliSense window that will pop up. If that does not occur, for example, if I misspell first name text box and I press the dot, I do not get that IntelliSense window. So always be on the lookout for that little window to pop up, otherwise you know you have misspelled a control. Now, every control has a default property. In this case, the default property is text. But we don't want to select text at this point because there is a special method that has been designed in Visual Studio that will clear the contents of a text box. And that is simply the word clear. So as I begin typing the word clear, by simply typing the first two letters, CL, you can see in the list that clear has been chosen. So I could simply press the enter key and that completes the process. I don't need to type the rest of the word clear. I can allow IntelliSense to accept it. Now you'll notice that the word clear is has a set of parentheses after it, and this will be discussed later when we talk about functions and methods in more detail, but this is one indication that this is a method as opposed to a property. A property will not have the parentheses. For example, if we reference the name label.text here, the text property is written in this manner, where a method is written with parentheses after it. Those parentheses will have more significance later. So I need to do likewise for each of my text boxes. Last name text box dot clear, again simply accept it. So I will add each of the text boxes in a similar fashion. So now I have added each of the remaining text boxes with a clear method after it, and this should now allow me to run the program and test the clear form. So I first need to enter some sample data, obviously, to test this process. And now I'll click the Create Label, but I wouldn't have to, and I'll click Clear Form. And as you can see, the Clear Form has indeed cleared the entire form, that is the text boxes. Notice also, though, that the address label section of the form has not been cleared. If you want to do so, we'll discuss that shortly. To clear the contents of the labels, however, is a slightly different process than the text boxes. Returning to the form and then double clicking on the clear form button. If I drop down below the text box group, since this is a separate routine, I will create a line of a comment that says this clears the labels. Now, the names of the labels are name label, street label, and city, state, zip label. So using the name label as an example, I will type name label dot, and you'll notice that there is not a clear method associated with labels. Instead, what you must do is to clear the contents of the text boxes. This is one difference between the text box and a label. From a coding standpoint, a text box has a clear method where a label does not. To clear the contents of a label, you must actually delete the text property, delete the contents of the text property. Now notice when I am entering the quotation marks for the contents of the text box that I'm not placing a space in between the quotation marks. That is because I don't want to enter a space in the text property. I simply want to set it to a null value. And for text properties, which are character type data, a null value is indeed double quotes with nothing in between. So I'm just going to leave this as it is so that you'll see that the code will only do what you tell it to do, in that it will clear the name and the street label text boxes or labels, but it will not clear the remaining one. So let's run our program one more time. Create the label, and then click on the clear form, and you can see everything is indeed cleared except for the last label. And that is simply because I failed to clear that in the code. Now we will further modify our address label maker program to include some radio buttons. And we'll see how you can write code to interact with those radio buttons. As you can see, I've entered some data for our address label maker program. And as we know from previous movies, we can click Create Label, and that will create the mailing label in the first name, street address, city, state, and zip code. And I could now select, I've added a group box with radio buttons to indicate whether this is a new customer or not. So if I click the Yes button, that yes, this is a new customer, and then I could then do some further processing. But if I'm now ready to go to the next customer, and I want to clear the contents of this form, I can click Clear Form, and as we know, our code does indeed clear the text boxes and also clears the labels. However, you notice that the radio buttons, yes and no, have not been cleared. So let's take a look at the code to work with the radio buttons. So I'll stop the project, open up the Clear Form radio button, scroll to the bottom, and let's add another comment that says this will reset the new customer selection. Since we really don't know whether the user checked the new customer yes or no button, and it does not really matter at this point in time, we simply want to clear the selection. So even though we know by default only one of those two radio buttons, either yes or no, would have been selected, what we want to do is simply clear both of them. Now, it will not create a problem if we clear a radio button that has not been selected. So let's check our drop-down list and find the names of the radio buttons. And as you can see, one is called Yes radio button, and the other is the No radio button. It does not really matter what order we work with these, but I will simply write Yes radio button dot, and once again, if the control is recognized, it will then present the IntelliSense list. Now with radio buttons and also with checkboxes, there is a property called checked. And as you can see, if you type the word check, and it will eventually find the word checked. If you select that and then set check property, and as soon as I press the equal sign, Visual Basic knows that I have two choices. A radio button either can be checked or not checked. That is, it is either false or true. So if I want to reset the yes radio button, I will set that to false. In essence, unselecting it. And then I simply do the same for the no radio button. Set that equal to false as well. So now I have reset both the yes radio button and the no radio button. And regardless of which one they selected, they both will be returned to their default state of not being selected. So we'll test our program once more. I now create label. I'll choose yes for the new customer. Click the clear form. As you can see, all checkboxes as well as the radio buttons have been, and the labels have been cleared. Even if the user has selected no, since we included that in our code, that would have been selected as well. If we had checkboxes instead of radio buttons, this would be handled in basically the same manner. You still have a checked property, just like you do with radio buttons. You have a checked property associated with checkboxes, and they should be set to either true or false. Now let's take this one step further, since we're in our code window here. And let's say that when we reset the form, that we want to make the no radio button our default. That is, have it pre-selected. So I can right here type no radio button dot checked equals, and I can now set that to true. And I'll write a little comment here that tells us what we're doing, which will say set no radio button as the default selection. So what we're saying here is clear the contents, clear all the labels and radio buttons, and then go back and reset the no button to true. So whether it was selected or not before, it will now be reset to no. So let's test our program one more time. I've now created the label, and I'll choose yes again. Click clear form, and notice everything is cleared, but now the no radio button has been pre-selected for me for the next customer. So in addition to clearing, you can actually set the value of a radio button, or a checkbox for that matter, to true by setting it equal to true. In this movie, we will focus on the visible property. As a programmer, you can create a situation where objects or controls become visible or invisible either at design time or through code, and therefore execute at runtime. In this sample program, I have two buttons, one for the visible function and another for the invisible function. That is, clicking on the visible button will cause the labels to appear. Clicking on the invisible button will cause the labels to disappear. I have three labels, and I'm simply going to allow them to be named as their default name of label 1, label 2, and label 3. And they simply contain some text so that when they appear, we can see that they're visible. By default, most controls are visible in their property window. For example, if I click on label 1 and go to the visible property, I see that it is set to true. I can change this to false, and I'll do likewise for the other two labels as well. Now the initial setting that you set for a property is only going to be in effect when the project initially runs. Once the project is running, then the user's actions and ultimately your code will control the visibility, or for that matter, any property state. Now, let's take a look at the code window for the visible button, which, since our objects are going to start off being invisible, we will need to write code to make them visible. Again, remember I'm simply using the default names of label 1, label 2, and label 3. And I'm going to write code that will simply make the visible property become true. So label1.visible equals true means to set the visible property at runtime to true. The end result, the label becomes visible. And I will do likewise for the remaining two labels as well. Notice that as you type this in the Visual Basic environment, the visible property is linked to the IntelliSense, which says there are only two possible values, either true or false. So when you are keying in code, you want to pay attention to the IntelliSense cues to prevent some very common mistakes. Now we'll run this project even before we write code for the second button. So as the project runs, as you can see, or as you don't see, the labels are not visible. By clicking the visible button, those three labels now become visible. The invisible button's job is to make those labels disappear. So we'll need to write code to make that happen. Going back to the form and double clicking on the invisible button, we now have an event procedure open up for us so we can write some code. Now of course what we could do at this point is to simply type in label1.visible equals false, label2.visible equals false, and so forth. Or we could simply copy and paste the code in the code window and then simply change the values of true to false. And then very quickly we have now created another event procedure. So let's test the program. Again, the initial setting is being controlled by the properties window, which was set at design time to false for those three labels. Clicking visible causes those three labels to appear. Clicking the invisible button causes those three labels to disappear, but only because of the code that we've written over here in the code window behind each of those buttons. Visible, invisible. Take note that there is not a property called invisible. The property is visible, and it can be set to either true or false. Oftentimes there will be occasion where you will want to write code for the same control but affect multiple properties for that same control. This demonstration program will focus on that aspect. The program that I have created consists of three objects. One is the message box, create message. One is the form itself. And there is also a label that you cannot see at this point because I have made it invisible. Now, when you're working with a control that is not visible at design time, it sometimes can be a challenge. But there is a way that you can access these controls even though you cannot physically touch them with the mouse. And that is by going to the Properties window and clicking the drop-down arrow at the top of the Properties window, which will reveal a list of controls or objects that are currently on the form, including the form itself. And there you see the label I was referencing is called Label 1, and then the Create Message button is called Message Button. Now if I want to do something at design time with the Label 1, I can simply click, and then you see where its location is on the form. And if I wanted to, for example, give it a border style at this point, I could do so by going to the border style property and changing the none to fixed 3D. I could also change the auto size property from true to false, and therefore you can see the original size that this label was when it was drawn onto the form. Now let's take a look at how you can affect the same control, in this case Label 1, and you can affect multiple properties in code without having to repeat the control name every time you want to reference it. So I'll first change the auto size property back to true, I will take away the border style, and for your reference, note that the text is empty. There is no text in the label. Now, the code is going to be associated with the Create Message button. So I will double click, and that will reveal the event procedure window for the message button. The code I wish to write is as follows. I want to provide you the entire code so that you can see it and be able to recognize the true advantage of creating this structure. This is using something called the with structure, W-I-T-H, and you can see the with and then the end with statements. Now, with and end with are key words, and everything is in between the words with and end with is referred to as the with block. Now, the control name immediately after the word with, in this case label 1, is the control that the following properties will be associated with. Now, if I were to write this code one line at a time, it would look something like this. Label 1 dot visible equals true. And then if I want to change the foreground color of that label, I would need to write label 1 dot forecolor equals color blue, or whatever color I might want. And then the third item would be label 1 dot text, and then the message I want to appear in the label. Now, as you can see, this is requiring 3 lines of code. And each time I write the code, I have to repeat the name of the control. Label 1, label 1, and label 1. On the other hand, I could accomplish the exact same task with simply typing label 1 once after the with statement, which then says everything that I list next is to reference label 1. Now note the syntax that's required, and that is the dot before visible, forecolor, and the dot text. It's just like you would need the dot to separate the object from the property if you were to write them on 3 individual lines. You need the dot here so that the with statement understands that this is associated with the control that's immediately precedes it. So if you had, say, 10 or 12 properties that you wanted to change for a particular control, repeating the name of the control each time would get a bit monotonous and tedious. Where in this structure you could simply write it once and then list the following properties. So I will delete the code that's not necessary at this point, and we will test our code. And when I click on the create message, the code we just saw will be executed, and the 3 things occurred. That is, it became visible, it became blue, and it also became filled with the content of the message, here I am. So this is a very handy coding tip and shortcut method that you can use whenever you find yourself repeating the same control over and over again. Of course, now keep in mind this has to occur while you're within the same event procedure.
playboy. It's about time, and your time's up. I had to do this one for my girls, you know. Sometimes you gotta act like you don't care.